On a February evening in 1928, 23-year-old medical student Theora Hicks looked out from the passenger seat of her date's car and watched downtown Columbus, Ohio pass by. Theora was pale and pretty with cropped brown hair. She had on a fitted dress and wore her father's old watch on her wrist. She was wearing a dress that night to go out, but Theora often wore pants, dress shirts, and ties, a fashion trend that some women had embraced in the 1920s to show that certain types of clothes were not just for men. Theora's date turned his car onto a rural road that led out of the city, and Theora watched the buildings of Columbus give way to open fields and farmland. She turned to her date and smiled, and he smiled back. Theora's date that night was a man named Marion Myers. He was significantly older than Theora, almost 35 years old at the time, and he was tall, skinny, and bald. Theora and Marion had met on campus at Ohio State University. Theora went to medical school there, and Marion worked in the university's agricultural department. They had been seeing each other off and on for over a year, but only Theora's closest friends even knew Marion existed, because Theora did not talk much about her personal life. Her best friends knew that Theora occasionally went on dates with Marion, but they thought she never took any of those dates too seriously. And unlike most of her friends, Theora never talked about wanting to meet the right guy or getting married. In fact, some of Theora's friends had started to wonder if she even liked men at all, and they thought maybe seeing Marion was just a way for her to cover up the fact that she was actually interested in women. But her friends could never be sure, because when Theora talked to them about her life, she almost always focused on her dream of becoming a doctor or on the social changes she wanted to fight for that would give women more rights in a society that was still heavily dominated by men. Her friends loved that Theora was passionate about important subjects, but most of them still thought the way she lived her life was kind of strange. Even the fact that Theora was going to medical school seemed totally out of the ordinary to them, because in the late 1920s, women made up less than 5% of all medical students in the United States. In the car, Marion asked Theora how school was going, and she smiled again. One of the reasons she liked spending time with Marion was that he believed she had as much right to be in medical school and to become a doctor as any man did. Theora said school was going well, and that she was really busy with classes and work, but she didn't mind. Theora had worked hard in school her entire life, and she continued to work hard at medical school to achieve her goal of becoming a doctor. And so far, her commitment had paid off. While in school, Theora had spent time working in the veterinary department at Ohio State, alongside one of the most respected veterinarians in the country, Dr. James Snook, who invented a revolutionary technique for spaying cats and dogs. And soon, Theora was going to start working at the campus hospital. Theora believed that any work experience in a medical facility would help her in the future when she was looking for a job, and she thought that having connections like Dr. Snook would lend her credibility in a profession that a lot of people thought women had no business pursuing. Marion pulled his car onto a dirt road that was almost hidden by the fields that surrounded them on both sides. The road was bumpy, and the car shook a little. Theora laughed as she got tossed back and forth in the passenger seat, and then she saw their destination ahead of them. They were going to a shooting range kind of in the middle of nowhere, a few miles outside of Columbus. The place was popular with amateur marksmen and hunters in the area, but Theora and Marion were not going there to shoot guns. The location of the shooting range, and the fact that it blocked the view of people driving by on the main road, had made the open field near the range a popular spot for couples to go to have sex. The range had become so well known for this that people in Columbus had nicknamed it Shirt Tail Alley. Marion drove his car past the shooting range and a little way into the open field and parked. Theora leaned across the seat and kissed him, and then Theora slipped off her dress, Marion took off his clothes, and they climbed into the cramped back seat together. But just a few minutes later, they heard someone pounding on the car door. Theora and Marion froze. Then they heard a policeman telling them both to get out of the car. Theora looked at Marion, and she almost started laughing. She reached into the front seat, and she grabbed her dress. Outside, the policeman stepped away from the car, turned his back, and allowed Theora and Marion to step outside and put their clothes back on. Then, after they were dressed, the officer issued them both a ticket for the crime of fornication which was defined at the time as sexual intercourse between two unmarried people. And the officer told them they would each have to pay a $20 fine, which would have been over $350 in 2023. The policeman told Marion and Theora to go home, and then he got into his car and waited for them to leave. Theora and Marion climbed back into Marion's car, and right away Marion apologized for putting Theora in that situation. Theora said she wasn't angry, and she wasn't ashamed or embarrassed. She believed part of achieving greater rights for women was getting rid of the judgment and ridicule that young women her age often endured when they had sex before they were married. But Theora was not naive. She knew that a lot of people still frowned on things like premarital sex, so much that it was technically against the law where she lived. And even though Theora did not agree with that law, she didn't want more incidents like the one she had just had to adversely affect her future. Theora knew the odds were stacked against her when it came to having a successful career as a doctor, so she didn't want to make her dream any harder to achieve than it already was, and she didn't want to give anybody an excuse not to take her seriously at med school. So, in the months after she got caught with Marion, Theora talked even less about her personal life with her friends, and her friends noticed that Theora didn't go on dates at all anymore. Even when Theora went to parties with her friends and their boyfriends, she never brought a guy with her. But Theora's friends didn't worry about her because she seemed happy, and she seemed even more focused on medical school and her future. And by the beginning of 1929, a few months after Theora turned 24, she felt like her dream of becoming a doctor was actually within her reach. Her classes were still going well, she was training for a new position at the hospital on the Ohio State campus, and there was a chance that she was going to get to help Dr. James Snook, the respected veterinarian she had worked with, on a book he was writing. And so, even a lot of Theora's friends and family, who had wondered why she had gone to medical school in the first place, started to believe that Theora was close to achieving her dreams. At about 7 p.m. on June 13, 1929, over a year after the fornication incident at the shooting range, Theora stood in her small bedroom in her apartment in Columbus, Ohio. She was reading a letter, and she felt her heart beat a little faster. The letter started off, "My dearie, I awakened early at about 7 and of course thought of you at once." Theora read about how much the person who had written the letter couldn't wait to see her again, and Theora smiled at the writer's signature at the bottom of the page. In big letters, it just said, Janet. Theora put the letter from Janet back into one of the drawers in her desk, and she got even more excited about her plans that night. Then Theora looked in the mirror to check her makeup and clothes. She was wearing a sleeveless brown dress with a white collar and a rhinestone belt, and she had her father's old watch on her wrist like she always did. Theora grabbed her purse, stepped out of her bedroom, and saw her two roommates sitting in the living room of their apartment. The two young women saw Theora, and a look of shock came across both their faces. They couldn't remember the last time Theora had gotten dressed up to go out on a date, but they were sure that's what she was doing. Theora told them she was going out with somebody that night, but she didn't say who. Then she told her roommates she would see them when she got home, and she went outside. She walked down to the end of the street and hailed a cab to take her to the Ohio State campus. On the drive, Theora asked the cab driver if she could have one of their cigarettes because Theora was nervous and she thought maybe it would calm her down. The driver reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack, and handed her a cigarette and matches. Theora lit the cigarette, but only took 2 puffs before she put it out, and she still felt nervous and excited. When Theora got to Ohio State, the sun was just setting, and she thought the campus looked like it was glowing. She walked down a tree-lined sidewalk towards the parking lot by the student center, and she saw a blue Model A Ford Coupe parked in the lot. That was Janet's car. Theora looked around to make sure nobody was watching her, and then she walked quickly to the blue coupe, she hopped into the passenger seat, leaned over, and gave Janet a kiss. And soon after, the car pulled out of the parking lot and headed out of Columbus. At 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, June 14th, so the morning after Theora had met Janet on campus, 2 teenage boys stepped out of a car and walked through the high grass in an open field near the shooting range outside of Columbus. The boys both loved shooting rifles at the range, and that morning they had decided to have a contest to see who was the better shot. As they walked through the field, the boys laughed and talked, and each of them boasted about how they were going to win the competition, but then one of the boys stopped and stared a few feet ahead of them into the field. His friend stopped behind him too and asked what was going on. The boy pointed his finger to where a swarm of flies were buzzing around something on the ground that was hidden by the tall grass. Both of the boys squinted to get a better look, and they wondered if maybe there was a dead animal that was attracting all the flies. So they walked a bit closer, the sound of the flies getting louder and louder as they approached. Then the boys both stopped again because they thought they saw a pile of women's clothes on the ground. The boys looked at each other and laughed. They knew the reason couples came to this field by the shooting range, so they figured, maybe a woman who was here with her date had been forced to run off without her clothes because the cops had shown up. But the boys were quickly more interested in the swarm of flies and whatever was below them, and so they took a few more steps forward, and when they got close enough to actually see what was on the ground, they both started screaming for help. Pretty soon, the farmer who owned the land and who had been working nearby ran over to the boys. The farmer looked down at the ground where all the flies were swarming, and he told the boys to go get the police. The boys turned around and ran back through the field to their car. They got in and drove a few minutes down the main road to the small local police station. They ran inside and told the first cop they saw what they had found in the field. 2 police officers ran out of the station, got into their car, and drove to the field where the boys had just come from. About an hour later, Detective Otto Phillips of the Columbus Police sat at his desk going over some notes on a case he was working. Phillips's phone rang and he answered it. A police officer from a small department outside of the city was on the line. He told Phillips that a body had been discovered in a field near the shooting range and the local police needed help. Phillips hung up the phone and put away his notes from the other case. He figured that case wasn't nearly as important as a dead body that was just found in a field. Phillips stood up, put on his jacket, grabbed his fedora hat, and headed out of the station. He drove a few miles outside of Columbus and saw several cars parked on the side of the road next to the open field by the shooting range. Phillips got out of his car and walked towards the small group of men that had already gathered in the field. Phillips saw there were 2 cops from the nearby station, the county coroner, and a police photographer. Phillips knew the coroner well, but he introduced himself to the others and then asked if they would all clear some space for him. All the men moved back, and Phillips took a few steps forward. And right away the sound of the flies buzzing and the smell hit him first, and then when he crouched down, he saw the body of a young woman. Phillips took off his hat and tried to swat the flies away. Then he leaned in closer to the body. The victim was lying on her left side, and her face was on the ground. Her right arm was stretched out in front of her, and it was very badly bruised. Phillips knew this shooting range was like a lover's lane for young couples. So his first thought was that this crime scene could be the horrible result of an argument that this poor girl had had with her boyfriend. Phillips stood up and called the coroner and the other officers back over. The other officers said they had not located a weapon of any kind in the area, and they also said they had not yet found any identification of any kind on or near the victim. The coroner pointed out to Phillips that the victim's watch had stopped at 9:58. He thought that was probably close to the time that she had been killed the night before. The victim's head, face, and neck were covered in blood, and so the coroner said he would run some blood tests when they did the autopsy. But in police investigations in 1929, blood tests were basically only used to determine 2 things: if the blood belonged to a human or an animal, and what the blood type was if it was found to be human blood. But a lot of people share the same blood type, so Phillips knew a blood test could not identify a specific person. So as Phillips stood there in the middle of the field, he had no idea who he was looking at, and the test the coroner was going to run would not make that any clearer. But Phillips had to figure out who this young woman was before he could even start thinking about who might have killed her. The news of the body found outside the city did not take long to spread. And that afternoon, two of Columbus's newspapers ran salacious headlines about the dead girl found at the infamous Lover's Lane, nicknamed Shirt Tail Alley. Normally, Detective Phillips hated those kinds of headlines, and he couldn't stand that newspapers often put wild theories in their articles before anything was even known about a case. But that afternoon, Phillips thought the attention-grabbing newspaper stories might actually help him figure out who the murder victim was. And Phillips would be right. Not long after the newspapers went out that day, two young women arrived at the Columbus police station. They said they had seen the articles about the body found in the field, and they were worried it was their roommate, because she had gone out the night before, but never came home. Phillips thanked the women for coming in. Then he asked them if they would go with him and another officer to the mortuary where the body had been taken to see if they could identify the victim, and the women agreed to go. So the women took a short drive with Phillips and the other police officer. Then they walked into a cold, quiet room in the mortuary. The officers led them to a table to see the body, and the women stood there in shock. They hugged each other and started crying. The victim's face was mangled and bloody, but they could still see it was their roommate, Theora Hicks. Phillips said he was sorry to put the women on the spot when he knew how upset they were, but based on where police had found Theora's body, his instinct was that whoever had killed her was most likely a man she was seeing. So Phillips asked if they knew who that man might be. The women talked to each other for a second, and then one of them told Phillips that they knew Theora had gone out on a date the night before, but that she was very private about her personal life and almost never talked about who she was actually seeing. But the woman said there was one guy who Theora had always seemed to go back to in the past, and that was an older man named Marion Myers. Phillips thanked the women again for all their help, and then he and the other officer took them back to the station. Later that night, Phillips began looking into Marion's background, and it didn't take long for him to think this guy was the perfect suspect. Phillips learned from the officers at the small department outside of Columbus that a year earlier, Marion had paid a fine after he had been busted for fornication. Phillips also learned that Theora had been in the car with Marion when police found him, and that the incident had taken place in the same field where the teenage boys had discovered Theora's body. Early the next morning, so June 15th, the county coroner was sitting in a small office at the mortuary putting together notes from Theora's autopsy. Then he heard footsteps outside the office. The coroner put down his pen, got up from his desk, and walked out of his office. And he got startled when he saw a tall, skinny, bald man pacing back and forth. The coroner asked why the man was there, and the man looked at the coroner and said he wanted information about the dead girl police had found at the shooting range. The coroner asked who the man was and why he thought it was okay for him to be there, but the man just kept pacing and asking about the dead girl. So the coroner just turned and rushed back into his office and called the Columbus police to tell them what was going on. But by the time the coroner hung up and walked back out of the office, the tall, skinny, bald man had already disappeared. But when the coroner described this man to the police, they were certain it was Marion, and Detective Phillips was already planning to bring Marion into the station that day. Not long after the call from the coroner, Phillips sent officers to the house where Marion lived on the Ohio State campus to get him and bring him in for questioning. The police found Marion at the house and quickly drove him to the station. Marion was already Phillips's prime suspect, and his bizarre behavior at the mortuary just made him seem even guiltier to Phillips. Phillips led Marion into a small interrogation room. It was a cool day, and it had been raining, but Marion looked hot and sweaty. Phillips asked Marion about his relationship with Theora. Marion said they had dated on and off for a couple of years, but they were not dating anymore. Marion said he loved Theora, but she did not love him. And he was sure that she was seeing someone else even when they were together. Phillips asked Marion where he had been on the night of Theora's murder. Marion said he had nothing to do with what happened to Theora. Then he proceeded to stumble through a story about everything he had done on the day of the murder to prove that he had an alibi. Phillips felt like during his time as a detective, he'd learned how to read people pretty well, but there was something about Marion that he just couldn't quite figure out. Marion came off as a jealous, jilted lover, and there was a chance that he was making up his supposed alibi on the spot. But Phillips also got the sense that this was the kind of guy who would go into a panic and start rambling, even when he was asked a simple question, like what he had eaten for dinner the night before. So by the end of the interview, Phillips still considered Marion a major suspect, but he wanted to know if Marion was right about Theora seeing someone else. Because if Theora was dating someone else, and that was who she had gone out with the night she got murdered, Phillips needed to find out. Later that morning, Phillips and other members of the investigative team went to Theora's apartment, and her roommates showed them to her bedroom. At first glance, Phillips thought it looked like the typical bedroom of a young single woman. But when he opened one of the drawers of a small wooden desk, Phillips started to think there might not be anything typical about Theora at all. In the desk drawer, Phillips found a Derringer, a small handgun that was easy to conceal. Next to the gun, Phillips found a couple of bank passbooks, which were savings account logs that people kept in the 1920s, and when Phillips looked at those passbooks, he was stunned. Theora had at least 2 savings accounts with almost $2,500 between them. For reference, at the time, that was more than the average American family made in a year. Also, $2,500 then would have been equal to about $45,000 today in 2023. Phillips had talked to Theora's roommates and a few of her other friends after her body had been identified, and they had all said that Theora worked on campus just to make enough money to get by at medical school. So Phillips was surprised that she had thousands of dollars in savings, and he started to wonder if Theora had been living some kind of a double life. Then Phillips opened another desk drawer, and he found something that immediately backed up that double life theory. Phillips pulled out a stack of letters that had been written to Theora, and they were all from someone named Janet. And once Phillips had read through the letters, it seemed clear to him that Theora and Janet had been in a very serious romantic relationship. So Phillips needed to find out if Janet was the person Theora had gone out with on the night of her murder. But Phillips didn't have a last name for Janet, and when he asked Theora's roommates about Janet, they said they had no idea who Janet was. A few hours later, Phillips and his team met with Theora's classmates and people who she worked with at the campus hospital. But nobody they talked to knew anyone named Janet. And so the police went down their list of other people to talk to, and they saw there was a guy named Dr. James Snook who Theora had worked with in the veterinary department. And so they contacted James and they asked him if he'd be willing to come to the police station and answer some questions about Theora. And James said fine. He came down to the station, and he sat down with Phillips and the other members of the investigative team. Phillips immediately thought James looked and talked exactly like a typical professor. He was 49 years old, he wore a nice suit and glasses, and whenever he talked, it sounded like he was explaining things to a big group of college kids. James told the police that Theora had once worked in the veterinary department in the steno pool, which meant she took notes and shorthand in meetings and at lectures. And James said Theora had been great at her job, and so he thought she might be able to help him while he compiled stories for a book he wanted to write. Phillips asked what the book was about, and James got a little embarrassed and said he was working on a book about himself. Because not only had he been a pioneer in veterinary science and medicine, but also he'd won a gold medal at the 1920 Olympics in Belgium. Once that information came out, immediately the officers started asking James questions about what it was like to compete in the Olympic Games and what it felt like to win gold against amazing athletes from all around the world. But eventually, Phillips got the conversation back on track, and he asked if James knew of anyone named Janet who worked in his department at the university or who might be connected to the veterinary school in some way. James thought about it for a minute, but said nobody came to mind. But he admitted that after being a professor for years, he was not great about remembering all the names of all of his students. They kind of blended together. And then at the end of the interview, Phillips thanked James for coming in and said they'd follow up with him if they needed to. After that interview, Phillips was getting frustrated. He had figured that Janet, the person who wrote the love letters to Theora, had to be a classmate or coworker, or at least somebody Theora knew from school. But so far, the search for Janet had been a total dead end. And the team was still looking into Marion's alibi, so they couldn't rule him out as a suspect. They even decided to bring Marion back in and to keep him at the station until they were sure they knew where he had been on the night of the murder. But Phillips was having doubts that Marion was the killer, and he was almost positive that Theora's secret lover, Janet, had something to do with Theora's death. Later that day, Phillips met with the coroner at the mortuary, and the results of Theora's autopsy threw Phillips for a loop. At the time of her death, Theora had traces of marijuana in her system, but it wasn't from smoking marijuana, which would be the most common way to ingest the drug. Instead, Theora had ingested a very uncommon type of marijuana in powder form. In addition to that, Theora had also ingested something even stranger: blister beetle extract, more commonly called Spanish fly, which was a chemical substance taken from an insect. At the time, some people believed Spanish fly was an aphrodisiac that heightened a person's sexual performance, but Spanish fly was not exactly easy for anyone to just get. So by that evening, Phillips was starting to feel like this case that had seemed pretty straightforward at the beginning was just getting weirder and weirder and weirder. So by that evening, Phillips was starting to feel like this case, which had seemed pretty straightforward at first, was now starting to seem really complicated and just totally weird. And then later that night, the case got even weirder because Phillips got a phone call from a woman who said she was a landlord and that she was sure she had rented a small apartment in the city to the dead girl she'd seen in the newspaper. Phillips hung up the phone with the landlord and just shook his head. In the course of about a day, he discovered Theora's gun, her shocking bank accounts, her love letters, and her secret apartment. But he still didn't have the one piece of evidence he badly wanted. He didn't know who this Janet person was. On the same night that Phillips had spoken to that landlord, he and a few other officers drove across town to see the apartment Theora had supposedly rented. Phillips was exhausted, and he felt like that day might never end, but he hoped maybe something in this new apartment would either prove Marion was the murderer or lead him to Janet. The landlord walked Phillips and his team into the small one-room apartment. A large brass bed took up most of the space, and there was one wooden chair in the corner. Phillips also saw a back door that would allow people to come in and out of the apartment without being seen by anybody on the street in front. One look at the place, and Phillips knew this was a classic love nest where people would meet to have a secret affair. Phillips showed the landlord a photo of Theora, and the landlord said that was definitely the woman who had rented this place, but she'd used a different name. The landlord also said Theora had told her she would not be renting the apartment anymore and would move her things out that week. Phillips and his team searched the room for any piece of evidence that might help their investigation, but it looked like Theora had already moved out because all they found was a woman's brown hat lying on the hardwood floor. So when Phillips's long day finally ended, he still had Marion in custody at the police station, but he didn't really have anything new to go on. In the days following Detective Phillips's visit to Theora's secret apartment, police were able to corroborate almost all of Marion's alibi for the night of Theora's murder. But there was still about 30 minutes that night that Marion could not account for, and nobody close to him had seen him during that time. 30 minutes was long enough for Marion to have driven Theora out to the field by the shooting range and to have killed her, so Marion remained a prime suspect. Then, even though the investigation into this case had only been going on for a few days, the county prosecutor started to put a lot of pressure on Phillips and his team. The county prosecutor was new, he was young, and so the police figured he just wanted to make a name for himself by bringing a big-time murder case to trial. But the county prosecutor pointed to the continuing stories in the newspapers that were spreading wild rumors about a maniac roaming the streets of Columbus who wanted to hunt down more young women. So the prosecutor said this case needed to be closed soon before there was complete panic across the city. Detective Phillips agreed with that, but Phillips was convinced he wouldn't be able to close the case until he found this Janet person, the person he was sure was having an affair with Theora when she was killed. So Phillips and his team kept interviewing new people connected to Theora, and they circled back around to talk to people they had already met with to see if maybe they had missed something the first time they spoke. Then, just after 11 a.m. on June 18th, so 5 days after Theora's murder, police brought a woman in who they hoped could move the investigation forward. The young county prosecutor would lead the interview. He asked the woman a series of questions over the course of 4 hours. And when the woman was tired and worn down, she said something that made Phillips and the prosecutor rethink the entire investigation. What they heard in that interview would finally lead Phillips to his Janet, and the police would discover who had killed Theora. Based on the interview led by the county prosecutor of that woman, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night someone murdered Theora Hicks on June 13, 1929. On that day, at about 9 p.m. at night, Janet's blue coupe pulled into the parking lot near the Student Center on the Ohio State campus. Janet was wearing pants, a dress shirt, and a tie. Janet was nervous and kept glancing back and forth to make sure nobody was watching the car. Then Janet saw Theora walking towards the parking lot. Theora got into the car, gave Janet a kiss, and they sped away from the university. A few minutes later, Theora found herself staring out at fields and farmland as they headed to the shooting range outside of the city. Theora knew this drive well, but something felt a little different that night. She felt a little lightheaded and maybe a bit confused. Still, she was excited to be going back to the shooting range. She had avoided it ever since she got caught by the police there over a year earlier, but she figured with as dark as it was going to be that night, the police wouldn't find them. Janet eased off the gas and turned onto the road that led past the shooting range and parked in the field nearby. Theora looked over at Janet and smiled, but Janet just looked away. Theora's head started to feel even lighter than it had on the drive over, and her face was starting to feel flushed and hot. Then Janet turned to her and said something that made Theora very angry. Theora snapped a comment back, and then before long, the two were arguing. Theora was livid, and she shouted at Janet, and then Janet screamed even louder back, and before long, Theora just felt so lightheaded and so angry that she just wanted to get some air. So Theora grabbed the door handle, but before Theora could get out of the car, Janet leaned into the back seat, picked up a hammer, and smashed it into the back of Theora's head. Theora heard ringing in her ears, but she was still conscious, just totally stunned. The cramped car had not allowed Janet to really get a full swing before she hit Theora. Theora's head wavered back and forth, and she turned and just stared at Janet in stunned silence. And Janet simply raised the hammer again and began striking Theora over and over again in the face. Theora felt warm blood running over her eyes, her cheeks, and nose, but she managed somehow to open the car door, and she stumbled into the field outside. Janet flung the driver's side door open, rushed around the car, grabbed Theora by the arm, then Janet raised the hammer high and brought it down again on the back of Theora's head. Theora slumped forward onto the ground. Her arm hit the ground hard in front of her, and her watch actually broke. Janet just stood there, staring down at Theora as blood began to pool around her, and Theora was still moaning and gasping for air. Janet thought that sound was absolutely horrible, so Janet dropped the hammer, took out a pocket knife, crouched down, and slit Theora's throat. Theora would die in that field. Then Janet grabbed the hammer off the ground, ran to the car, tossed the hammer and knife into the passenger seat next to Theora's purse, and then Janet sped away from the field and back onto the main road. Early the next morning, Janet went to the secret love nest and almost completely cleaned it out. Then Janet drove the blue coupe to the Ohio State campus and got the car washed by the custodian who worked at the university's veterinary school, where Janet was a professor. Dr. James Snook, the Olympic gold medal winner and widely respected veterinarian, was Janet. He had murdered Theora. It would turn out that James and Theora had been having an affair for years, but they had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. And so after Theora had gotten caught fornicating with Marion at the gun range, it really frightened James that they might get caught having their affair, and so she and James worked even harder from that point on to completely cover their tracks. That's why Theora almost never talked about her personal life. That's why James and Theora had rented an apartment they could sneak into through the back door, and that was why in all of their correspondence, James used a fake name, Janet. Ultimately, Theora wanted James to leave his wife for her, and she would get jealous and angry when he spent time with his family. And so sometimes Theora would go out with Marion just to try to make James jealous. But Theora did always hope that she and James would somehow work out their problems and be happy together. And in the days leading up to the murder, James had said that he did not want them to rent that secret apartment anymore. So Theora thought that meant maybe James was finally going to tell her that he was leaving his wife and that they could bring their relationship out into the open. But James had absolutely no intention of doing that. He was not about to leave his wife. He just wanted to stop renting the apartment with Theora. And he worried that when he told Theora this, she would end up telling his wife everything about their affair. So James decided to kill Theora. It turned out James's gold medal in the Olympics was for pistol shooting. So he was very familiar with the shooting range outside the city, and he would still go and practice there sometimes. He thought the shooting range's reputation as a sort of lover's lane would provide him cover and make it look like the murder was the result of an argument between a young couple. On the night of the murder, James was a little bit hesitant, but when he told Theora he was going to be going away for a while with his family, Theora snapped and got really mad. And so James just reached back into the back seat, grabbed the hammer, and followed through with his plan. But James got caught because the woman who spoke to Detective Phillips and the county prosecutor at the police station was James's wife. The police had brought her in because they had begun to suspect that Theora was more to James than just someone who could help him with his book. And they wondered if maybe James's wife had killed Theora in a jealous rage. But after hours of being interviewed, James's wife revealed that James had left the house and been gone for a long time on the night of Theora's murder. And so police dug deeper into James's background, and they discovered that James had been taking amounts of money out of his bank account that matched the amounts in Theora's passbooks. They also learned that James had easy access to the powdered marijuana and the Spanish fly that Theora had ingested because, at the time, both of those substances were used in veterinary medicine. But it was never determined if James had drugged Theora or if she had taken the substances willingly. When Phillips and the county prosecutor brought James in to be questioned again, he would first admit to being Theora's secret lover, Janet, and then he would ultimately confess to murdering Theora. James was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. In February of 1930, so less than a year after James had killed Theora, he was executed in Ohio in the electric chair. IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, is a measure of someone's intelligence. To find your IQ, you need to take an official IQ test, which gives you an IQ score. The vast majority of people will score about 100 as their IQ, and so that's considered to be the average intelligence for any given person. But a very small number of people will score somewhere between 130 and 160, and so that's considered to be a very high IQ. Those are very, very gifted people. And then there is an even smaller group of people that score above 160. And so that is the genius class. Anybody who scores above 160 is literally a genius. To give you a sense of just how rare that is, Albert Einstein, who is largely considered to be one of the smartest people to have ever lived, he was not even considered a genius, at least not by his IQ. He was about 160, so right on the cusp of geniusness. But as we will learn from this story, having an exceptionally high IQ does not make you immune to making unfathomably bad choices. In 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Katarik, who had a genius IQ of 170, so she was smarter than Albert Einstein, she graduated from UCLA Medical School with honors. She completed her medical residency, which is like a multi-year apprenticeship for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, which is one of the very best hospitals in America. After that, she opened her very own practice just north of LA in a town called Bakersfield, California, and she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, she was successful, and she loved what she did, and her patients and her students loved her right back. Fast forward to 2010, Jackie was 49 years old and she was still running her very successful practice, and she was still teaching at UCLA, and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the details of their relationship are not really publicly known, it's fairly easy to deduce from the reporting that came from this case that Jackie and William fought a lot. On Wednesday, August 25th of that year, Jackie was spotted by herself at a Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield, California, having some drinks. And then at some point during the night, she called a ride service to pick her up and take her home again. Even though we don't know this for sure, it's assumed she was too intoxicated to drive, and that's why she called the ride service. The following morning, Jackie did not show up for work. Her assistant at her medical practice is the one who noticed Jackie had not shown up, and so when she didn't, she called her boss, but her boss didn't pick up. And so after a couple of failed attempts at getting in touch with Jackie, this assistant called Jackie's boyfriend, William. And so William, he picks up the phone, and when the assistant asks him, "Hey, have you seen Jackie? She has not come into work today," William actually says, "Yes, I saw her last night." William would explain to the assistant that the night before he was in his house by himself in Bakersfield, California, not far from this restaurant where Jackie was last seen. And he said that at some point, unannounced, he saw Jackie pull up in front of his house. And so he could tell from her general demeanor and her look and her pace that she was upset about something, or he just sensed there was going to be some conflict if he went to the door. And so he decided to actually slip out the back door and kind of run away from his property before Jackie could see him. And so he actually left the property and went to a friend's house who was nearby and spent the night with this friend. And so when the assistant called William, William was actually still at this friend's house. He had not been back to his actual property. And so he would tell the assistant that, the last I saw of Jackie, it was late at night. She had pulled up in front of my house, but then I split. So I don't know what she did. I assume she left. But William would tell the assistant that, I'll go back over to my house and I'll see if she's still there or if there's some indication of where she might have gone. And so William hangs up the phone, he leaves his friend's house and walks the couple of blocks back to his own property. And when he gets there, sure enough, right out front of his house is Jackie's car. Now, William knew his house was locked and Jackie didn't have a key. And so Jackie must just be sitting in her car waiting for him to return. And so William walks up to the car expecting to see Jackie and expecting probably to fight about something. But when he gets up to the car, Jackie's not in there. But her purse, her cell phone, her wallet, that's all over the inside of the car. And so William turns and looks at his house thinking, is she in the house? Did she somehow get in? Is she on the back of the house? And so William just starts yelling out for Jackie as he begins to walk around his house. And so as he goes around towards the back of the house, he's yelling out for Jackie. No one's calling back. And then he reaches the back of the house and there's no sign of Jackie, but he sees there's a shovel on the ground near his back door. And then he looks at his back door and it looks very obviously like someone, probably Jackie, had been using the shovel to try to pry open the back door. Like they were trying to break in, but it hadn't worked. And so William just kind of sees that and then continues walking around the other side of the house. So he's completely walked around the entire property. There's no sign of Jackie. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must have gotten in somehow. She's in the house somewhere. And so William goes to the front door, he unlocks his front door, he goes inside, and even though he knows all of his doors have been locked, all the windows are locked, he's kind of on edge because he's thinking she's got to be in here. But he walks through his house and there's no sign of Jackie, and there's no sign that anybody else had been in there since he was last in there. And so he's totally puzzled because it doesn't really make any sense that Jackie's car is out front, but he's thinking, okay, maybe she got here and then she called a ride service and went somewhere else, I'm sure she's fine. So William calls the medical assistant and says, look, her car's here, her stuff's here, but she's not here. I don't know what she's doing. I'll let you know if anything comes of it. The assistant said, I really feel like something's off here and we really do need to call the police. And so William would say, you know what? I think that's a good idea too. Let's just get them involved and make sure she's okay. And so they call the police, and the police start by going to Jackie's residence. But Jackie's not there, and there's no sign of her. The neighbors haven't seen her. And so the police go to William's household, and they search Jackie's car, and they search William's house and the surrounding area right outside. But there's really no clues as to what actually happened to Jackie. And so after the police talked to a bunch of neighbors and friends and family, they just told William and this medical assistant that at this point, they just need to wait, and that hopefully Jackie will just come out of wherever it is she's hiding or wherever she's gone. Maybe she's upset. Maybe she was fighting with William and she's run off somewhere, but we just gotta wait and see what happens. 2 days later, Jackie was still unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her when William's friend went over to his house. William, the day before, so 24 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, he had left the country on a prearranged trip. But he was not being looked at as a potential suspect or having anything to do with Jackie's disappearance, and so he was allowed to go. And so this friend had been asked to go to his property to feed his fish. And so he shows up on Saturday, that's 48 hours after Jackie has been reported missing. He goes inside the house, and immediately he is hit with this terrible smell inside of William's house. And so he's covering his face, and he's walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell is coming from. He thinks it could be the fridge, maybe something's rotting that's fallen out, or the door's open or something, but it's not the fridge. He goes to the trash, it's not the trash. He goes to the fish, it's not the fish. He makes his way over to the fireplace, and he realizes that's where the smell is coming from. And so kind of reluctantly, he gets down and he kind of smells inside the fireplace, but it's not really coming from the area where the logs would be. It's coming from up in the chimney flue. And so he puts his head down and kind of turns and looks up the chimney, and about 2 feet up the flue, dangling down, are 2 human legs, and they would be Jackie's legs. It would turn out a few days earlier, when Jackie was at that restaurant drinking by herself, she did call that ride service to come give her a ride home, presumably because she was too intoxicated to drive. But before they showed up, Jackie just got into her car anyways and drove to her estranged boyfriend's house. And so she gets there. William, meanwhile, is sneaking out the back and running off to his friend's house. Jackie does not see him. She makes her way up to the front door and presumably tries to knock and get William's attention, but when no attention is given to her and it seems like no one's inside, she decides she's going to try to get into the house. And so the front door was locked, the windows were all locked, she got to the back door, and that was locked, so she tried the shovel and tried to pry it open, but it didn't work. And so eventually, Jackie climbed up the permanent ladder that's on the back of the house. There isn't much online describing this permanent ladder. It could be a fire escape, or it could be some sort of lawn decoration, but there was something on the back of the house that you could climb up if you wanted to. And so Jackie climbed up this permanent ladder and actually got onto the roof. And then when she was on the roof, she walked to the center where the chimney was, and there was this cap over the top of the chimney to prevent things from going into the chimney. She removed the cap and then lowered herself feet first into this chimney. Now, it's unclear how quickly she descended this chimney, but eventually she got stuck because the width of this chimney was not uniform. It started fairly wide at the top and then narrowed as it went down. And so at some point, as she went down feet first, she would have gotten completely wedged. It wouldn't have mattered if her hands were above her head or by her side, because either way, they were useless. She couldn't bend her arms, and there was nothing to grab onto, so her arms couldn't do anything. And then below her, there was nothing for her feet to push onto. And so she was totally stuck. And since William was not in his house, he had left, there was no one there to help her. And so Jackie probably started screaming for help, but as soon as she did that, and she exhaled that huge scream, her chest would have constricted from exhaling, and that would have shrunk her chest, making her thinner, and she would have dropped a little bit farther into the chimney. And then when she breathed back in again, her chest would not be able to expand back to its original position because the chimney would be restricting her. It's like this brace that's around her chest that as she gets lower and lower and lower, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so her lung capacity is shrinking second by second. And as her lung capacity shrinks, she would not have had the lung strength to emit a loud enough sound to get anybody's attention. Basically, she couldn't scream. She couldn't take in a big enough breath to scream out. And so she was just stuck in this totally compromised position in this claustrophobic little chimney where she could do nothing but wait and hope maybe William or someone took notice of the fact that she was in here, even though, again, she couldn't get anyone's attention. And so most likely she would have begun rationing her breaths, because again, every time she breathes out too much, she goes farther and farther, making it harder and harder to breathe. And at some point, starting on Thursday night, she would have heard William in the house. He would have been only a few feet away from her, but she can't make a sound loud enough to get his attention. And we know she was alive by Thursday night because neighbors heard someone faintly yelling help on Friday night. So nearly 48 hours after she got stuck in the chimney, it's believed she was still alive. And those neighbors, when they heard that faint call for help, they assumed it was kids in a nearby pool, and so they didn't do anything about it. When they found out what had happened, they thought, you know what? It was coming from that chimney. That's where we heard it coming from. Jackie would die shortly after the neighbors heard her calling for help because she was dead by the time the friend found her in the chimney the following day on Saturday. Jackie would die from mechanical asphyxia, which is basically suffocation, but it's caused by some physical obstruction. And in this case, it was the chimney. The chimney literally crushed her chest to the point where she could no longer inflate her lungs. It would take firefighters approximately 5 hours to break this chimney down to finally retrieve Jackie's body. No charges were filed against anyone for Jackie's death. It was ruled to be an accident caused by an unbelievable error in judgment by an unbelievably brilliant woman. Our next story is called Gold Digger. In July of 1988, 18-year-old Adriana and her husband, Jay Dickinson, were living in Anchorage, Alaska, just 1 month after getting married in Nevada. Jay, who had lived in Alaska for several years before Adriana joined him, had taken up an interest in something called placer mining, which is basically mining riverbeds for minerals like gold. And as soon as Adriana moved in, she picked up the hobby as well. The area they mined for gold was south of Anchorage in Cook Inlet. Jay owned a gold claim there. Over the years, Jay had found it to be very cumbersome just getting to Cook Inlet. Even though it was just south of Anchorage, the roads forced him to drive all the way around the inlet before being allowed in. However, he had discovered a shortcut. During low tide in the inlet, one of the two northern waterways that fed into the inlet, called the Turnagain Arm, would be completely dried up and it would turn into this huge open mudflat. And so Jay could leave Anchorage, go south, leave the highway at the Turnagain Arm, and drive directly over and across the mudflats and reach his gold claim in half the time. On the evening of July 14th, the young couple decided that the next day they wanted to go gold mining. And so Jay checked the tides of the inlet to see what the status would be for the next day, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that very early the next morning there would be a low tide, perfect for them. And so the next day, the couple got up at sunrise, they hopped in their Jeep, and they started heading south. They left Anchorage, they hopped on the highway, and they went south all the way to the access point to Turnagain Arm, and they looked out in front of them, and sure enough, it's completely low tide and it's ready for them to drive over. As they turned off the highway and drove down the small access road that brought them to the actual mudflats, they passed by a series of signs telling them not to go on the mudflats. But Jay had done this dozens of times without any incident, and Diana, she'd done it only a couple of times, but both times it had been no big deal, so neither of them paid any attention to the cautionary signs. Soon they were rolling across the mudflats on their way to Jay's gold claim. But on their way, their Jeep suddenly got stuck in the mud. And Diana, she hopped out, she went to the back of the Jeep and began pressing as Jay pushed down on the accelerator. The Jeep eventually lurched forward and was free of the mud, but Diana was actually now stuck in the mud because as she pushed, she drove both of her legs down deep into this mud. She tried to pull herself out, she couldn't do it, and so Jay hopped out of the Jeep, walked around the mud, and got to his wife and began pulling on her. He couldn't get her out, but he told her he had a good idea. He went back to his Jeep and he got his dredge that he was going to use to try to look for gold, and he pushed it down into the mud and began sucking up the mud around one of her legs. And he figured if he just created enough of an air pocket by sucking out enough mud, she could pull that leg out, and then he could do the same thing with the other leg. And although it was a slow process, it was working, and slowly but surely they managed to get one of her legs out of the mud right as the 38-degree water began coming in because tide was starting to come in. Neither of them were panicking because the dredge was clearly working, and if they could just get her other foot out, it wouldn't matter that the water was starting to come in. They would be able to get back to land, back to the highway, before they got caught in the high tide. And so he put the dredge down next to her other leg, and he began pulling the mud out, and it was working, but then the dredge broke, and he couldn't fix it. And Deanna's starting to panic, Jay's starting to panic. He puts the dredge back in the Jeep, he gets a shovel, and he runs back to his wife and begins frantically trying to dig her out, but he can barely move the mud. It's like it's cement. And that's actually the reason why there's so many signs around these mudflats telling people to not go on them. Because there's a very small window of time between low tide and high tide where the ground goes from being solid and you can drive a car on it to being very soupy, and it's very easy to get stuck in it. But before the tide completely comes back in again, it re-hardens. And so if you're stuck in the mud and you don't get out again before it hardens again, you will remain stuck in the mud and 30 feet of water will come in on top of you. And so Deanna's trying to pull her leg out and she's panicking, and Jay is doing everything he can to try to get down there and get her foot out, but the ground's hardened at this point. Her leg is completely trapped inside of the mud, and the water is starting to come in faster and faster and faster. Jay told her he had to run back to the highway to try to get some help. He couldn't take his Jeep. There was too much water that had come in. It's now up to their knees, and so their Jeep's worthless. And so Jay is running away from Adriana, who's screaming for help. She's trying to get her leg out. There's nothing he can do. And so he's running through the water. He gets up to the highway, and he manages to flag down some motorists, and he pleads with them to please come out into the water and help me get my wife out. She's stuck in the mud. And they look out and she's flailing around and screaming, and the water is now up to her waist. And so two of these motorists actually run down into the water with Jay and risk their own lives to try to get Adriana out. Meanwhile, another motorist took off for a nearby cafe where he could alert authorities that someone is trapped and they need someone out there right now. Very quickly, the fire department and the state troopers arrived on scene, and they look out and they see the motorists and Jay trying to pull Adriana out, and the water has crept even higher up on her body. She's screaming, she's panicked, and Mike Opalka, who's one of these state troopers, he immediately ran over to the fire department and he got this big rubber tube, and he charged into the water and ran out to Adriana and grabbed her and said, everything's going to be okay, we're going to get you out of here. And he gave her the tube and he says, you need to start breathing through this, the water's going to be over your head soon. And so Adriana, who's shaking because she's hypothermic and because she's terrified, she takes this tube and she's clutching it as the other rescue workers are running down with all their equipment to try to get her out. And then not that long after that, the tide had come in to the point where it was over her head, and all they could see of Adriana was this rubber tube she was keeping out of the water. But unfortunately, every attempt the rescue workers made failed, including getting a helicopter in and attaching a harness to Adriana and trying to pull her out that way. Nothing worked. The first responders and the motorists and everyone stayed with Deanna, holding on to her and trying to pull her out, but at some point the water was too cold and it was getting too deep, and they could not stay out there with her long enough. Michael Polka, the state trooper, was the last one out there with her, and he was struggling to keep his head over the water as he's still trying to pull her up, and at some point he noticed the tube she had been breathing in popped up on the surface with both ends exposed, so it had come out of her mouth. And so he fumbled with it, but his hand was so cold from the water he couldn't really grip it. He tried to reach down to give her the hose, but she was flailing and panicking, and she couldn't get the hose. She could not breathe through it, and at some point she went still. And Mike knew there was nothing he could do. She was gone, and so he let go of her, and being hypothermic himself, he barely was able to swim back to the shore and get out and go up onto the highway with the others. And there they sat for the next 6 hours as they waited for the tide to come all the way in and then go all the way out again and loosen up to the point where they could go out and retrieve Deanna's body. Unfortunately, had authorities been alerted to Deanna's situation a little bit earlier, they could have got a special water pump out to the mudflats, and it would have been able to get her out even if the mud was hardened. But by the time that pump arrived on scene, it was already too late. The water was well over Deanna's head, and she had already let go of the tube.
The next and final story of today's episode is called All the Way Down.
Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside, expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't, and he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response, and so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him, and so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it, and so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold, or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, we're going to be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're going to get you out of there. Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well.
When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top and they said he's not here. And then all of a sudden they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing, and so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, "We're gonna get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're gonna get you." And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired. He was sore. He was freezing. He was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor, who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not publicly available online.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please bring the Amazon Music follow button to Komodo Island to go apple picking, but secretly tape a stake to their back. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the